Well, good morning.
Hello, everybody. Are we projecting adequately? Morning, Glenn.
Good morning, Shelley.
There's been quite a bit of scene setting, so I'm going to repeat a tiny bit of that, but not too much, about the broad agenda of today's forum, but I also then want to do a fraction more scene setting about Glenn. Not much, because then the point is to get him talking, not me. But if you just bear with me for a couple of minutes. As has been said, the theme of the 2019 Living Cities Forum is future needs. Key challenges around population growth, climate change, social impacts have been raised. They sort of don't need to be raised because we're feeling them and experiencing them every day in our cities, in Australia and around the world, I'm sure. But to focus our mind on a couple of those, I wanted to mention some stats and other bits and pieces. Andrew's referred to population growth. We're currently in Melbourne at 4.93 million. By 2050, on a medium growth projection, we're heading for 8.5 million, so that's medium growth. The higher growth projections are much more significant. That's being most keenly felt in key growth areas, such as, for example, in the west of Melbourne, from Wyndham up to Hume municipalities. We've currently got about 500,000 in population. We're heading for 1.35 million by 2050, again on medium growth projections, so we're kind of turning that whole chunk into the size of Adelaide. We also have 76% of the state's population in the city, and that's fairly typical. On climate, we know we're seeing the impacts of climate change all around us. We're experiencing those, but also as an affluent nation in the Asia-Pacific region, we're probably a go-to place for what's likely to be a highly displaced large population of poorer Asian nations. So, we worry about maybe 300,000 immigrants or refugees coming to Australia per annum. What if that's tenfold or 100-fold with climate impacts? We need to be thinking about that as well. We're seeing already places like Tasmania. Richard Flanagan wrote devastatingly and poetically and very confrontingly about bushfires in Tasmania and the loss of incredible ecologies there that have been there for a very long time because of temperature rises. Murray-Darling Basin is tragic. They're just things to keep in mind. On social impacts, I just wanted to read something else briefly. An article in The Conversation that was published on Monday by John and Janet Stanley and Peter Brain noted that with population growth, the social divide is increasing. Seems obvious. The research shows that as travel distances from central Melbourne increase, we see declines in population and job densities, median house prices, capital stock per person, the proportion of higher educated people, the proportion of jobs that are high-tech, local government area productivity, the proportion of people living near public transport, and public transport used to get to work also declining. And we also see a decline in trust in others. This is something they've mapped. We also see increases in open space per resident, car used to get to work. These seem obvious, but it's worth noting them. The proportion of commutes that are longer than 2 hours, and reports of heart disease and obesity. So extrapolate those out with population growth and climate impacts, and we're looking at some not great things. They're complex and urgent problems. They're also interconnected. I don't think there is a simple, singular solution, and Andrew's referred to that as well. I think solutions are required, but perhaps instead of just knee-jerk, one-dimensional technical ones, they're more sophisticated, nuanced and complex solutions. So having said that, I want to pause a minute and take you in a slightly other direction. Glenn, you're known for your exceptional architectural work, perhaps best known for your houses, but as Andrew said, there are other projects. You won the Pritzker Prize in 2002, which, for those who don't know, it's the world's highest honour for an architect or architects. In their citation, the jury noted that, and I'm just going to quote a little bit of it, Glenn Murcutt is a modernist, a naturalist, an environmentalist, a humanist, an economist, and ecologist, encompassing all of these distinguished qualities in his practice as a dedicated architect who works alone from concept to realisation of his projects in his native Australia. Although his works have sometimes been described as a synthesis of Mies van der Rohe and the native Australian woolshed, his many satisfied clients and the scores more who are waiting in line for his services are endorsement enough that his houses are unique, satisfying solutions. His is an architecture of place, architecture that responds to the landscape and to the climate. So with all of that as a preamble, I want to start by asking you, is there a relationship or are there useful parallels to be drawn between your approach to the design of an individual building, such as a house, and the development of solutions for the city-scale challenges of population growth, climate change, and their consequences for Australian society and for humanity? Just a small question to start off with.
Just a very small question to start.
We've got about 40 minutes or half an hour to answer it, so...
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that there are many pressing issues that go beyond the work I have been doing. I have not eschewed areas of work. People have asked me, why haven't I done a whole lot of group housing? Well, the answer to that is that nobody's asked me. And that's all I can say. I just haven't been asked. One of the great problems in a practice is if you do a building that becomes highly recognised as worthwhile, then that becomes like an actor where you're playing the role and everybody wants you to do those sorts of buildings. Now, that's taken me outside of the urban fabric for a long time. But it's only more recent times, for example, in Melbourne, I have completed the first stage of the Islamic Centre at Newport. That came to me as a very much out of the blue sort of a project. But the great problem in this country are the clients who are wanting to do an extension of the work you do. It is the wrong basis for a client to find an architect. My view is if you want an architect to do a project, you look for one who hasn't ever done that sort of project, but who thinks, who is able to translate the ideas into other ways. I'd never done an education centre, and together with Wendy Lewin and Reg Lark, we did the Boyd Education Centre. Had we been asked previously, how many education centres have you done? We wouldn't have received the project. So there is this role playing between client and architect. Now, back to some of these issues. One of the most important things to me in practice has always been to do ordinary things extraordinarily well. Never set out for publicity, but to do things really, really well. And I found that to be a sole practitioner without staff has given me the freedom of expanding time to be able to devote oneself to actually working further and further into a project. And the most important aspect to that is to understand place, to understand placemaking. For example, one of the great problems in our urban environment is that we're not understanding the place that we're working. We don't have respect. Respect is one of the most important issues. Respect for nature, respect for the landscape, respect for the river, respect for the environment, the sky, the air, the wind, the smells. These are the things, the ings, I-N-G-S, the smelling, the perceiving, the understanding. These are the things about placemaking. And whether it be which I don't really believe too much in the huge complex, I really prefer when you think of cities, take Paris for example, You don't walk down a street of Paris and look at individual buildings. This is one of the great problems in planning, in my view. We, as in education, have been taught to design single buildings as if they're all individual buildings that basically don't have a connection. And we're even reinforcing that by providing space between buildings throughout the city, throughout the suburb. What is this space about? It's lost space. It produces huge wind patterns that are uncomfortable. We don't need that space. Look at Paris. You're designing streets that are walls, that have got holes, that have got markets, that have the most wonderful types of shops, of restaurants, of cafes. It is fantastic. But you're not looking at individual buildings. Therein lies a basic issue, I think, in the modern city, whether it be in the Western world or whether it be in other worlds. It is a really huge problem. The suburban house, for example, where you're requiring to have 0.9 of a metre setback on the side and 0.9 on the other side, is the first major mistake. We should be required to build boundary to boundary and have our land divided by quarter or even less, so that we can design beautiful courtyard houses, that we can design buildings that are related to the minimisation of land. And today, with the advent of the computer, we can even work from home. In Australia, for example, we've got people who used to work in the city now working in Byron Bay. We've got people who used to work in the city now working in Mudgee,
so Glenn,
in New South Wales.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there because there's lots of threads there, and before you get on to another one, I want to pick up some of those. You talked about the importance of place, and
yes,
that's something that I think is really evident in each of your projects, that there's a coherent language and expression, I think, through your work that's very evident. So that's across them. But for each one, there's a distinct relationship to the specifics of landscape. And I think that's really relevant to the city-scale problems we're talking about. I talked before about the growth in Melbourne's west, and what's also particular about the west, that's one of our biggest growth areas. There's a lot of city limits Andrew referred to. There's a lot of space within that is going to be filled with greenfield development. The climate and the soil types in the west of Melbourne are profoundly different from the climate and the soil types in the east of Melbourne. So we have clay soils, a lot of rainfall in the east. We have a fraction of the rainfall there, basalt plain, and ephemeral waterways. It's very flat. So that means that the landscape is profoundly different. Auntie Caroline spoke beautifully earlier, and I'm going to defer to Auntie Caroline about how Indigenous Australians are related to landscape, but what I understand of it is it's profoundly different from how non-Indigenous post-settlement use of the land, and I say use deliberately, has sort of overlaid alien systems of use rather than working with the landscape and its inherent qualities. So I'm just wondering if in your approach and a better understanding of Indigenous approaches to landscape, do you think we can, without sort of zooming out to city scale, tackle things like greenfield development, which does need to happen? You talked about ideas for houses a minute ago in development, but in specific areas, can we do that differently, potentially?
Well, we have to. The reality is that the British came to Australia on the basis at a period where Britain had back-to-back housing, disease, a whole lot of terrible things happening, and this was thought to be a great opportunity to give something that was suburban, and that became then the building in the landscape with landscape surrounding. Now, it's a very nice ideal, but that's gone berserk now, where the roofs are almost touching one another side to side, and that is a great issue. So we, in terms of looking at place making, one looks at the land, you start to look at the the deep structure in the landscape. You're looking at the conditions of the earth. You're looking at the deep conditions of the earth. Then you're looking at the flora. You're looking at the fauna. You're looking to see what is living in that area. How do you respect that? Do you look at the climatic conditions? Where does the wind come from? How can we cool this building? Whether it be a single building, a multiple group of buildings, or a multi-storey building. And particularly coming ahead with the potential that we're going to have in the very near future of electric cars. There's going to be a sound acoustic difference. It's going to be enormous in the city. The pollution level is going to be enormous in the city. We're going to be able to open the windows again in our cities so that our multi-storey buildings, if we're having them, can open the windows, that you can actually draw on prospect and refuge and ventilation and light.
Can I just ask you then to kind of zoom back in to, can you talk about exactly what you just spoke about then, but in like maybe one or two examples of your projects where you've taken a different approach because of what you've drawn from the particular landscape in each case? Or
sure. Well, a project I did in Kangaroo Valley, for example, on one side to the north was what's called the Wedding Cape Mountain, and then on the other, to the east directly, was the most beautiful peak, a plug from what was a volcano that came up. And so one is having these two forces working. And so the whole section of the house started to lift up to address the northern light, to address the Wedding Cape Mountain, which was beautiful. And then to the east was the wonderful plug. And so I put water elements in so that when you walk down the access way, you looked in the water before you saw the plug, but the plug was reflected in the water. And this was bringing the plug, and these are bringing these elements into the building. And so the building was working, in a sense, like an instrument. So if you think about these buildings as instruments as opposed to individual buildings in the landscape, you start to think about a composition, a composer writing, and then an orchestra performing. And in these buildings, one is in the audience as such as the occupier of the building, and one is being able to then, as the rain falls, you lift up flaps and the air can come in whilst it's raining, and you get the smell of the grass.
Right.
You get the smell of the landscape. You hear the call of a bird. These are really important things for our health.
Yeah.
The ability to listen to nature, to see nature, is really important.
So you're describing, in all of that, you're describing an architectural response, but what I'm hearing is a human experience.
It's a totally human experience.
So you're creating a place that people are living in and affected by, as well as they affect by. But you're building, I think, a connection to place, so the awareness of the water and the awareness of... And that's incredibly important, I think.
And so when I come back to the soil, I look at the trees, I look at the type of trees, I see where they are, how I can preserve them all, how I can minimally disturb the land, so that it is as if the house has rested there forever. And of course, as you get further south of Sydney, so the buildings sit on the ground. As you go further north of Sydney, so the buildings start to lift off the ground. The climatic variation between south of Sydney and north of Sydney is dramatic, because you have the effects of Kosciuszko coming in from the southwest, freezing winds in wintertime, and in summertime the northwestern winds from the inland coming down. So to be on the ground, you've got thermal response of the ground that works through the building, orienting buildings as much as you can towards the north. So you've got control of summer and winter. These are environmental issues that are really important, I think.
So there's environmental issues, so there's efficiencies there as well, obviously, because you're working with the environment. But there's also the connection of people to place and the building their awareness in everyday movement through a house.
Exactly. Then there's the topography. If the topography is doing this way, then I will always have a relationship that you're in the building and you can be there and you're always aware of the ground if it's falling this way, and you have a window or upper light, skylights that can show the land rising, so you know where you are in relation to the landscape.
And so you talked a bit about landscape. I mean, I think that's what we should be doing. I'm with you. But, you know, about Paris, and I kind of wanted to ask, people still talk about architecture and landscape and urban design and then all the other allied disciplines like engineering or whatever as in silos. We still tend to think of them, and at a broader level we talk about land use planning and transport still in a siloed way, although there are attempts to bring them together. Do you see I mean, you've talked about it a bit, so I'm not asking you to repeat, but I guess, how do you see landscape and architecture? Are they distinct, do you think? I know there's distinct expertise and knowledge, but are they different, or are they part of...
They have to be united. It's very important that they are united. And the idea of placing a building irrespective of the landscape, and you put around the edges a bit of fluffy landscape, which is what's happening. I mean, it's just awful. The building must respond. For architects, when you do a building, you need to draw a section of the site in several ways that's going beyond the site to 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres or 10 kilometres to understand where this is in relation to the whole project. Corbusier used to do that.
Part of a continuum.
It's part of a real continuum, but it's a three-dimensional, maybe four-dimensional continuum.
So on the fourth dimension, that's a good segue, something that's really notable, I think, about your work, and I think it's embedded in everything you've just been saying in a way, is predominantly houses that you're known for, but also, as Andrew has said, a number of other projects, larger projects and small ones, but a lot of spiritual projects, by which I mean things like the Australian Islamic Centre in Newport here,
the Buddhist
sanctuary. I think that's underway at the moment.
The design is just the initial stages, and that's going to have considerable modifications as it progresses, but it's one day at a time.
And I think, personally, I see houses as spiritual places. And what I mean by that is they're places that are private, and it's where we have our intimate lives in the sense of, you know, where we sleep and we find nourishment and we commune with our families and so on. And I just wonder, it doesn't seem to me to be an accident that you're commissioned to do these works with a spiritual aspect that's really important. And I just wanted to ask what you think about that.
Well, the first thing I have to say is that I am not a religious person.
Me neither.
I'm not a man of faith. But I suppose to divulge something is that I have deep feelings about what is responsible of each of us as humans towards one another. And my taking on the Islamic Centre in Melbourne here was not a difficult decision. The moment I had the phone call, I said, this sounds fantastic. I'd love to do this. And the extraordinary thing for me is, having worked with the community, at times difficulties, some thought I should be doing things that were tried and tested. I'd never done certain aspects of this building in my life, and there was some sort of suspicion about it. But it's all worked, and that is important. And so it's a question of immersion. It's a question of that state of reverie between sleeping and waking, and visualising, imagining. I used to say to my kids growing up, close your eyes and try and imagine the face of a human you've never seen before. It's not easy, but it's possible. And it's that ability to imagine. That's where today's education has a tremendous problem. With just not doing drawing is a really big problem, but I'll go into that later. But in terms of the spiritual side, I think it's about feeling. It's about empathy. Empathy is really, really critical. To listen, to destroy the ego is important, but to retain the ego as the driving force, but to recognise that one is always vulnerable, and one should be vulnerable. And if one has ever done any work that's decent, remember that it makes every work that's subsequent to that work vulnerable. So there's no resting on one's laurels. So it is that state of relationship of human to human. And when I worked with the Islamic Centre, here we had a group of people who were deeply spiritual. Out of this, I've made amongst the very, very closest friendships of my whole life.
Well, and which is beautiful, and I'm not surprised because of what I understand of your approach, but I think it's also relevant to these bigger challenges that we're talking about. The idea of empathy and humanity is perhaps the missing part when we design new roads or we enable new development. That's the old model. It's a kind of a one-dimensional approach that forgets about empathy and the importance of people's connection to place and meaning of place, as well as a sense of belonging, which to me seems to be a key to why you are commissioned to do those works and why you do them beautifully and they're revered.
Well, the interesting thing is that the Shaolin community from China, who are building this complex for 50 monks, a Zen meditation hall, together with laundries and kitchens and dining and all the other things. They came to me because they said, you've worked with the Islamic community. If you've done that and produced a building that has the spirit, it's a modern building that has the spirit that belongs to the Islamic community, then you can do the project for us. Yeah. And so they took me to China. I lived as a monk. I was dressed as a monk. I had to participate in meditation, which is not difficult for me to do, and do all the other activities that a monk does. Now, in that Zen sense, I would like to quote from, this was given to me following a lecture in Portland, Maine, and it was a beautiful thing. It was a little piece of paper that was 50 by 50 with the tiniest writing. And this man came up to me and said, I would like to present this to you. I think this is how you work. And I read it and I couldn't believe it. And I quote, we don't know where it's come from, no idea of its background, but I quote, there is something inherently quiet about the place and the men who designed it. In explaining their philosophy about living and working in one place, Mr. Smith paraphrased a Zen Buddhist saying he once heard in Japan. The real master in the art of living makes little distinction between his art and his leisure. He said, he simply pursues his vision of excellence in whatever he does, leaving others to decide whether he is working or playing. But to him, he is always doing both, which I think if we as architects are going to produce works that have not a religious basis, but have a spirit about the work, then it is about this work ethic as well as play ethic. To separate them one or the other, is losing the potential of that beautiful junction.
And that seems to be the key, I think, the sort of our tendency to polarise or separate things out. I mean, you've reminded me too about, again, I think some work I've been fortunate to be doing recently is working with traditional owners in looking at waterways in Melbourne, and reading Bruce Pascoe, Dark Emu, and I'm sure many of you have read that. It's a fabulous book, and learning a little bit more about how Indigenous Australians have occupied this country for centuries and centuries, which seems to have been much more about working in concert and as part of something. We're slowly, and in a much more nuanced and relational, respectful way, managing the land, gaining and serving their needs, but also giving back to that as one system. That's starting to change. So talking about the spirit, the Victorian Parliament, I think late 2017, passed new legislation that recognises the Yarra River through the Willip-Jin-Birrarung Marron Act, the Yarra River Protection Act, which is incredibly exciting. It recognises the river as a living entity, and that's also happened in New Zealand and other places, which is profoundly important. So rather than, we've tended to treat our waterways as drains, again, a one-dimensional, very limited approach, which is very destructive and deeply disrespectful, now regarding those, some waterways, or starting to think of those as living entities that we need to respect, that we shouldn't harm because they actually have rights, if you like, and we need them to have rights because we rely on them. That's just the glimmer of hope, the beginning of starting to think differently. Well, but that's about spirit.
Yes, and there are people in the world, architects like Georges Descombe in Switzerland, on the Aire River from Lausanne, where it was all channelled in a culvert drain all the way through for many kilometres. And he won a competition. And the drain was very, very vertical, straight through, picking up all the waterways, draining fields and what have you. That's how we as the white community do things. We just take a sledgehammer to it and we'll change the course of it, we'll put it in a drain and shove it away. Well, the reality is that he has, in winning this competition, he's paid respect to the existing drain, but he's done a beautiful drawing. And that drawing shows the drain like this. Then he shows the original river as it wandered through this area. And this drain cuts right through the river, as it would, because it picks up all this water. He has, in the competition that's now constructed, he has, in this drain, he has filled it to an extent. It's grassed. He's brought beautiful staircases down to it. He's put stops in it to create waterways, beautiful waterways with water falling over. There are things you can come down into the waterway, right down into it, steps that go into the water, others that come out to a beautiful platform which you can sit on and sit over the water. But then he structured this other waterway, and he did many tests on how to regenerate this waterway, not in a romantic way, but how I can set the pattern up so that this waterway can develop its own patterns. So I'm going to put in certain place things that are going to allow the banks to hold, that are going to allow a freedom of the water to find its pattern. And today, he's put in areas where the plants are growing, the flowers are growing in the waterway. People are using the central original culvert now as exercise paths, running, walking dogs. It's very beautiful. And he's taken, in many ways, he's made it better than even just a river meandering, because he's provided for the ability for the human to partake, to communicate, to talk to one another as they're doing this thing in this walkway, and the river to allow it to be independent but part of what it was. This is very beautiful. And think of the possibilities of waterways that, okay, we retain them, but how can we produce the river back into what it was? How do we clean the river? How do we clean the water before it gets into there? We have to start dealing with pollution. We have to start dealing with our waste. We have to start dealing with the rubbish we throw. We're getting better in Australia. Once I can go back 35 years and the side of the road was filled with rubbish, all with rubbish. Australians have changed the pattern. Ian Kiernan, who was the Clean Up Australia guy, saw so much rubbish in our oceans, he was so horrified by this that he decided to start a Clean Up Australia. And Sydney Water now, we've got, if you fly over Sydney Harbour, you can see down to the bottom of Sydney Harbour, you can see where the kelp is growing again. The big fish have come back into Sydney Harbour, and with the big fish brought all the big man-eaters, the sharks, have also come in. So we can't use Sydney Harbour and swim in it anywhere any longer. But how wonderful it is that when I first came to Sydney from where I lived in New Guinea as a child, my mother was able to eat the oysters off the rocks. We're now starting to talk about the potential of oysters being edible from the rocks in Sydney Harbour.
Which is amazing. I mean, and you're right, we have to hold on to that optimism.
And so here we've got, it's not all negative. For example, in the Thames in London, there were only slugs in the Thames. Today, the salmon are breeding up beyond Reading, which is amazing. These are really positive things. So we can achieve things in the cities.
So you talked about George Descombe's work with the air, and you used the word beautiful a lot, and we were talking about the spirit before. And I want to ask you about beauty specifically because I think it's important, and I think it's the bit that's hard to measure, and so often when we decide on a new bit of infrastructure or whatever, we put that aside because we can't stick that in a table and put a cost against it. It's harder to quantify. But do you think beauty is important, and what does that mean to you? What's beauty?
I think beauty's got to be very careful. Some would think it's a discipline in itself. It is not a discipline in itself. Today, the computer allows us to do beauty as an applique to buildings. So many buildings are designed so-called beauty or desperately interesting, in my words. They're about the computer that can do silly things. And there are so many silly buildings in this city and Sydney, just simply silly buildings.
Not beautiful.
Not at all. They're ugly. That's the other side of it for me. But beauty, you know, I think that you can't have so-called beauty, and I'm not talking about the application of beauty. You can't have beauty without the rational. And I think one has to actually work extremely hard at the tremendously rational approach to a work. Now, if you look at some of the most deadly aircraft in the world, which I hate as an idea, but if you look at them, there is an incredible joy in their form. There's a joy in the form of a live animal. There's a joy in the form of birds that do different things. The bird that's a seagull that can put his wings back and dive like a dive bomber. There's the beauty of a glider bird or a bird that can stay steady. But there's a rationale behind all of it. The rationale for the bird that's doing that is wants to see its prey. So it can stay there and then bang down. Or the seagull that's up there looking down and fast down into the water. And over its eyes, the protection comes into the water. There's phenomenal rational behind it all. So I'm interested in the junction of the rational and the poetic. I think this is extraordinarily important, that you can't have the poetic as the starter. It must be the rational. And the more you work at it, the better it becomes, the more logical it becomes, the calmer it becomes. As Louis Barragan said, any work of architecture that is designed without serenity in mind is, in my view, a mistake. And when serenity possesses joy, it is ultimate. And Johannes Pallasma, and I'd like to quote.
Yes, please. Yep.
He wrote this in 1993. Pallasma is amongst my very few closest friends. A marvellous Finn, writes beautifully. And I quote from Johannes in speaking of metaphorical to ecological functionalism. And he says, "I cannot imagine any other desirable view of the future than an ecologically adapted form of life, where architecture returns to the early functionalist ideals derived from biology." And this, by the way, E.O. Wilson, who's done biophilia, which is biological affiliation, the human requiring the biological affiliation with nature, derived from biology. Architecture will again take root in its cultural and regional soil. This architecture could be called ecological functionalism. This view implies a paradoxical task for architecture. It must become more primitive in terms of meeting the most fundamental human needs with an economy of expression and mediating man's relationship with the world, and more sophisticated in a sense of adapting to the cyclic systems of nature in terms of both matter and energy. Ecological architecture also implies a view of building more as a process than a product. More as a process than a product, which I think is really important. And it suggests a new awareness in terms of recycling and responsibility exceeding the scope of life. It also seems that the architect's role between the polarities of craft and art has to be redefined. After decades of affluence and abundance, architecture is likely to return to the aesthetics of necessity, in which the elements of metaphorical expression and practical craft fuse into each other again, utility and beauty again united.
Beautiful, thank you. That makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I think that's the key, that, and I completely agree with you, that beauty is about, it's like E equals MC squared. It's a complete, it's efficiency in that sense, not efficiency in a one-dimensional sense.
And remember, it's simplicity. And simplicity is the other face of complexity. It embodies absolutely everything, understanding of complexity, but it's resolved like a beautiful stock that's taken from the total down to the essence.
But look, I absolutely with you. I'm now thinking, how do we do that out in the west of Melbourne? I mean, I think there are clues, and I think the clues are in the landscape, the ephemeral waterways that come and go, which have tended to have places back onto them. I mean, we've got, unfortunately, a lot of industry that's backed onto them, putting in terrible trauma to waterways, where there's fires of poisoning the waterways, killing those water, which is terrible. But turning around so that we face them and draw on them as central, kind of the heartland. Little clues like that. Can you... I don't think we can solve the problem here in the next 5 minutes or so that we've got, but it's how can we draw on that thinking and that approach, which is a design approach, a fundamental...
Well, they're questions of principles.
Okay. The ingredients for city making, can we have some of those? What
Yes.
would they be?
They're all questions. When I've never worked outside Australia by choice. I will never work outside of Australia because I believe it's important that you need to speak the language of another nation to be able to work properly in that country. And so I work only within my culture. That is really important. So the first thing is to understand one's culture properly. Now, we have an amazing culture. We have one of the most amazing cultures in the world today. From Aboriginal culture, 60,000 years of Aboriginal culture, I have an Aboriginal goddaughter. I have a Bougainvillean godson. I'm very connected to the Aboriginal community in Australia, particularly Northern Australia. It is the most rewarding experience of my life to become part of that community. So to be listening to people, not to tell, but to listen, and to sit and listen to people's views about what is really required. To have a relationship that all buildings, you should be thinking about reduction in air conditioning. Air conditioning is the poison of all things. 75% of energy in the world is a consequence of sealed buildings. We're having to deal with sealed buildings now. We've got to deal with basics now. These whole issues that are so maddening, because there's nothing that tells you about a building that has an elongation that's facing north, that's benefiting by the winter sunrise through to winter sunset all day, and summer sunrise to sunset all day. We can design our buildings to relate to the climate. So we've got to relate to climate. We've got to reduce the loading on our energy. We have to look at methods not just of glasses that cost huge sums of money. I mean, glass costs about 10 times the amount of double brickwork, for example. There are a whole lot of issues that we can start to work with. Prospect, refuge, be able to have in buildings both prospect and refuge. Critical issues.
We need to enable, you talked about legislation there, basics, which is, all of our energy rating tools are blunt.
The energy ratings is mad.
But, yeah.
Because you're sealing the building, you have to air condition the damn
That's right.
thing.
But we end up with big boxes with tiny windows and so all that kind of stuff. They're the result of blunt technology. It's true. It's terrible. But that's the nature of legislation. That's the nature of rules. And we have to have some rules because we've got to protect the bottom line. But we also need to enable the kind of thinking that you've embodied.
But the problem is it stops the best and produces the worst.
That's true. So somehow, for me, I think we've got to get the Glenn Murcutts of the world, and there's not many of you, but maybe there are some others we can encourage and nurture to come up and be enabled to help with solutions to these big city scale problems, because it's design. You gave me this quote, Glenn gave me this quote just as we came in this morning. This is about process. You talked about process. This is from Billy Collins, former US poet laureate. He talked about poetry as well. So I'm just going to read it. Is that right? There was a question put to him: do you write longhand, manual, or compose at a keyboard? His response was, I always compose, and Glenn's written design on top of that, by either pen or pencil, only because the keyboard to me makes everything kind of look done, look frozen. And writing, in brackets drawing, on a page, gives me a feeling of fluidity, that what I'm writing is provisional for the moment. And also, since I don't know where the poem is going, and I don't want to know until I get there, I always feel like the poem, as I'm writing it, is working towards some kind of understanding of itself. And that to me seems to be about openness, absolutely open-minded, innovation, trusting and having faith in all of that stuff.
Fluidity in thinking.
So that's a design process that you can't, rules, there's just a great big gap there. And I'm trying to get, how do we get this kind of approach and the kind of principles and values that you've talked about into, it's a question for all of us, into how we deal with our cities.
It comes down to, first of all, education. Education for children. A way of thinking. Instead of educating children, for example, I met a Bougainvillean lawyer, barrister, black man, white as white eyes. At night time you only see white eyes. And he had been a barrister here in Melbourne. And I said, Joe, are you going back? And he said, no. He said, I'm here now. I'm back to my community. And I said, do you feel at all frustrated by all this, having had all that education? And he said to me, oh no. education is for its own sake. And this is one of the problems. We need to educate for its own sake, so that the creative processes are sponsored. And so there is the types of education that one is looking for a single answer, convergent, or there is the divergent education. And so there are many answers. And the real problem is we are largely educated to being convergent, not to be divergent. I was lucky enough to have divergent education, and that has allowed a tremendous freedom. I say to my students, never be afraid of losing a good idea. It may be good later on, but it's not good for now. It's important to have that flexibility of thinking beyond the norm, to be able to delve into the deepest aspects of our minds. I think the human brain is the most incredible instrument as an organ. It's an incredible instrument. And one can go into that state of dreaming. And to dream is to visualize. To visualize is really important. To draw is extremely important. We have a splinter, we draw it out. We reveal it. To draw is to reveal. To reveal is to see. To see is to beginning to understanding. And understanding is really critical to our ability to give back. We've got to take in a lot in our life before we can starting to give back. And I think that's really important. That aspect of giving back is critical. And I must say, raised on the works of Henry David Thoreau, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Their resignation is confirmed desperation. And since most of us are going to be doing ordinary things in our lives, the most important thing about doing those ordinary things is to do them extraordinarily well. And I think that's very important.
And I think that is a perfect note to finish on. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll have a